more than several years at this point, but I was sitting outside my sister's backyard in Denver, Colorado, and an air tanker flew overhead. And I remember thinking, this was the middle of, or the beginning of July, and I remember thinking, wow, there must be a fire close by for an air tanker to be this close. And then my sister and her husband said, oh yeah, didn't you hear about the fire near Netherlands? And my first thought was, well, no, I didn't hear about it. And I'm a little panicked because I had just started working at the time, working for the Wildfire Partners program as one of their mitigation specialists. And Kelly was also working as a mitigation specialist, but I was like thinking, well, this is interesting. Guess I'll go home and find out a little bit more about where specifically this fire is. And I had been doing home assessments through that program, starting in 2014, I should say, in 2015. And so I was a little worried about where this fire really was. So I went home, I looked up on the OEM site for Boulder County, and it started listing where the fire started and where some of the properties were that were affected. And one of the areas sounded vaguely familiar. And so I thought, so I looked up in my records from the year before of the assessments I had done. And sure enough, where the fire was burning was exactly where I had done an assessment, the same property location. And my heart sank because as an independent contractor at the time, it was sort of a worst case scenario. Is there's a fire on a property that I had assessed, and suddenly your brain starts working in a different direction of, did I do a good job? Did I know what I was doing? What kind of mitigation had the property owner done? All these questions. Well, fast forward a couple days later, I did finally hear from Boulder County and Jim Webster, and he forwarded an email from the property owner who had a structure lost. So it was an outbuilding structure was lost on his property. But more importantly, he said that his home survived. The fire had come up near or on his property, but everything else, like his garage, his home, everything survived. And he, I forget the exact quote, but it was, mitigation would make a true believer. This experience would make a true believer out of anyone for mitigation. So it turned out to be a successful story. And we talked to Jim, and we thought, well, why not make a mitigation story about this? So this was really my first foray into a post-fire assessment. And quickly I talked with Kelly because he had done post-fire assessments before. So I thought, well, even though I had been the assessor for this property, I certainly didn't want to do a post-fire assessment on my own since there would be other skill sets required. So we started looking at the information. Boulder County was supportive of a post-fire assessment. We dug through the report that we had given the homeowner and fire maps. We went most importantly to the property, and we talked to the homeowner. This was a couple months had passed. I think we were now in September, so the fire occurred in July. We went up there, and the homeowner gave us a tour of where the fire had occurred and the landscape changes that he had done over time for mitigation. We talked extensively about all of the work he had done in and around his home. So you can see a lot of the details here, and this was a really key for the success of the program and for the success of his mitigation. He had done even things where I had pointed out on my assessment where there were deck boards that required some repair and weeds around the stairs. He had replaced that with the pavement that you see here and the non-combustible border. So it was really impressive what he had done, and to talk to him. And then we were able to compare a lot of before and after pictures and come up with a report with the findings. So what had turned out to be, or what had started as a total panic mode for me of my worst nightmare as an assessor who lost a home in the assessment process or in a fire, actually turned out to be a really successful personal and professional moment for me. It was very rewarding, and I was really glad that I had the opportunity to talk with the property owner, to tour the area with Kelly and hear his insights and expertise. And so we wanted to share, we've done a few other post-fire assessments together as well. This was, again, before the Community Wildfire Planning Center, but we'll share in a little while a story about from Eagle County and an assessment from the Lake Christine fire. So again, we're focusing a little bit more on process as opposed to the outcome and the exact findings. And I'm going to turn it over to Kelly here to walk through some of those elements that we found to be successful when putting together or thinking about a post-fire mitigation story.
Thanks, Molly. So the first element that we identified was crucial to a successful post-fire story is the team itself that does it, and Molly shared some of the background for herself, and I shared some for myself, and having that diverse background of having an understanding of how wildland fires and wildland urban interface fires are fought, fire behavior, the forestry dynamics, and how structures burn is important. And the having that the outreach and the land use planning and understanding perspective is all of those together is an important component of the team expertise. So if there's a single person that manages to get all those skills together and has them, then great. But typically what we find is there's you usually require a multidisciplinary, multi-person team to successfully undertake this. Go ahead, Molly. Yep. The next element is the timing. Again, timing is extremely crucial. From the experience that we had with the two scenarios that we're going to share, was important. I was involved in some other post-fire mitigation story success and investigations, and it's really important to get in right as soon as you can after the fire is passed to really understand what happened and to really have access to both the physical environment and the people that were involved in it. So before everyone leaves and before the physical environment changes too much. Next, Molly. And kind of tied into that is making sure that you're able to collect accurate information, not only be able to collect that accurate physical environment information, but be able to collect information from the witnesses, the folks that were there, the experts that were there, and have some good understanding of what went on, but also the weather data, the fire progression information, and the general way that the event unfolded. Having the accuracy on timing and spatial information and everything else is important. And next, Molly. And this, is again related. That accurate information comes out of having access to interviewing those folks that were on scene. Really understanding the biggest thing that I think that we've found is really understanding what kind of suppression actions were taken, so that we can determine, whether mitigation actions were successful on their own, or whether they were successful because suppression was added on top of that. And this includes, anything that the homeowners or residents may have done, and of course anything that the fire suppression resources undertook. And finally, and not any less important, in fact, just as important, is understanding from the homeowner or the resident or anyone that actually undertook the mitigation efforts previous to the fire impingement, exactly what they did and what the property looked like prior to the fire coming through. And Molly, over to you.
Thanks, Kelly. So with the distribution methods, and I'm sure many of you have some other creative ideas on this, but some of the ways we found it to be most effective was in-person or virtual presentations, because we could really use a lot of visuals. So whether that's a PowerPoint slide or if you have access to videos, that's great. But some way to incorporate those visuals is very powerful. Again, the before and after, I think the photos tell a pretty helpful story, especially if you're there to explain what they mean. Story maps too, if you're well versed in putting story maps together, that can be a great method to have on a website. We also have prepared for, and you'll see this in a moment coming up with the Lake Christine post-fire case study, that we prepared a slide deck, sort of a general slide deck of information, and then we could modify based on the audience. So in some cases we've co-presented with Eric, who's our moderator today, and also Eric was able to present on his own, and to a variety of different audiences, so to peers, other professionals, the public, elected officials, just quite a variety. And you just tweak the message, but you still have the same basic information. So another point on that too, and I think during our Q&A or discussion, Eric may want to talk to this a little bit more, is having consistent talking points to share, especially with reporters, so that the same story is being told, and you are ready to tell the key findings rather than, you know, all of the kind of mitigation details that we might get excited about. You know, to synthesize or crystallize that into some very critical key points was very helpful when someone would ask, well, what really happened with this fire, and what should we know about it? So we're going to take a little bit more time with this next case study. It's the Lake Christine fire, and the Eagle County funded the CWPC to conduct this post-fire assessment on the effectiveness of how different wildfire mitigation activities may have had an impact on the Lake Christine fire, and whether structures were lost or saved, or whether they survived, you know, as a result of mitigation or a combination of suppression strategies. So this was a really good opportunity because it dovetailed into work we were already doing in Eagle County with Eagle County. So on July 3rd, 2018, the Lake Christine fire began at a local shooting range by two people who were illegally using tracer rounds at the site. You can see down in the very far southwest corner of Eagle County is where the area of focus is, where the fire was, and where our case study focused on.
So the fire initially on July 3rd exhibited some fairly slow progression and spread. But on July 4th, the fire behavior kicked up significantly due to some erratic winds, continued hot weather, and dry fuels that it moved into. And by the evening of July 4th, it was threatening multiple neighborhoods, and there was zero containment on the fire at that point. So looking at it from, you know, the landscape level moving towards the community, this photo shows that the fire actually pushed down and cross slope and initially challenged a mobile home park and the neighboring community in the bottom of the valley. There had been previous fuel treatment that occurred in 2005 in the Pinyon juniper fuel type that you see right sort of adjacent to the left of the arrow there. However, we didn't really see enough evidence that actually changed the fire behavior. And in fact, the fire crews that were on scene in the mobile home park indicated that there was actually no noticeable reduction in the fire spread when it did move into that fuel treatment area. Other things that really influenced this from what we determined in for the mobile home park in a positive fashion was the terrain and the topography and the slope where it looked like when the fire moved in in and down towards the mobile home park, the terrain started to have a more of a significant influence and pull it back up the hill. So it looked like it ended up being more of a, in the very end, and ended up a flanking fire for the mobile home park. However, this did create problems up into the communities up valley or upslope from the fire. At the community scale, there was both what we would call intermix and interface scenarios. You can see on the right hand side was the mobile home park, which was very much there was very much a defined line between the vegetation and the developed area. And in the Missouri Heights area, it was much more of an interface area. This resulted, the suppression resources had an opportunity in the mobile home park to essentially establish a line along that interface area and work the fire from the perimeter of the mobile home park. However, they did indicate that there was numerous spot fire ignitions from the embers. And on the left-hand side, you'll see that the Missouri Heights area was very much an interface area, which we'll hear, some more. We'll talk about a little bit more of the challenges that the fire suppression resources had in these areas because of that scenario. And the mobile home park was right where the fuel treatment had taken place in 2005, although we'd indicated there really wasn't much of a change in fire behavior. However, in the community, there was no evidence of any prior mitigation, and there was several factors that played in the wildfire event. For instance, there was the presence of power lines. Access into the area was into the Missouri Heights area. It was dark. There was the signage was sparse, so the fire resources from outside of the community didn't really know where they were or where they were heading. The roads were steep and winding. Driveways were also steep and winding. Many of the resources in the dark obviously had no idea what was at the end of these driveways, and therefore were hesitant to head up the driveways. There was some good situations in the community as well, such as a large hayfield that was irrigated that ended up changing the fire behavior once it hit the hayfield. And then we also saw the differences in topography between, there was homes were sited directly adjacent to slopes that didn't fare so well, and in other homes that were further set back or had very little slope influence that fared better. There was also county codes in effect in this area, but much of the development is predated to where those subdivision codes were brought into effect. And the next one, Molly.
Sure. So go ahead,
yeah.
Kelly.
Sorry, Molly, go ahead. Yeah.
Well, at the property scale, some individual homeowners had taken steps to mitigate the fuels in and around their home and also the home itself, and some had not. So we had looked at a variety of properties, and it really varied across the spectrum. You can see here, most of these pictures are from the Missouri Heights neighborhood or subdivision, but the lower right corner is from the mobile home park. And so we saw a pretty wide variety of mitigation. It's pretty safe to say that there was not mitigation at the parcel scale intentional mitigation that we could find cases of in the mobile home park, but there were in Missouri Heights. And more importantly, some of those properties had participated in the REALFire program. So the REALFire program is a program that CWPC administers in partnership with Eagle County and the Vail Board of Realtors. And it's modeled very closely to the Wildfire Partners program in Boulder County, if you're familiar with that, which is the same program I talked about at the beginning. So what REALFire is a property assessment program where a trained professional assessor goes out and does an on-site assessment and then talks to the homeowner about the steps they can take to mitigate their vulnerabilities. And they receive a customized report. Once they go through that process, they can get a certificate, which we'll talk about in a moment in a little bit more detail. But it's the opportunity for them to be recognized as meeting a certain standard for mitigation.
So the REALFire program really focuses on the home ignition zone, which includes the exterior of the structure itself, things like the roof, the walls, the decks, and any vegetation that is immediately adjacent. So what is commonly called Zone 1A, or the non-combustible zone, out to 5 feet. And that extends into the landscaping. And then, of course, the landscaping extends out to 100 feet plus, depending on the slope and terrain, and focuses on things like storage of combustible materials, like firewood, the condition of trees, whether they're pruned, and the density of the tree stems, and any other immediate landscaping conditions, surface fuels, and other conditions immediately adjacent to the home. And in the end, as Molly mentioned, a detailed report is produced that provides the homeowner with really a work plan on how to move forward with the recommendations that the mitigation specialist has provided. And accompanied with, so once the report, the homeowner indicates that they've undertaken the work indicated or recommended, the mitigation specialist returns, and in this case, you can see Eric was the mitigation specialist, and they do a inspection, and if all of the requirements have been met, a certificate is issued, and this is accompanied with the final report that the homeowner can provide for their insurance provider or whoever else is interested in the condition of the property, so that they can either get insurance, have insurance discounts, or maybe the intent of REALFire is that the property is marketable for real estate. So these are examples of some REALFire properties that Eric's undertaken. And I'm not sure, Eric, if you have any comments on this?
Yeah, we've, just real quickly, we've looked at around 350 properties through Eagle County and certified around 64, I believe. So these are some examples of homeowners that saw it all the way through, but it's we have many others that are working at some level. I'll just leave it at that.
And Eric, there was REALFire properties identified in the Missouri Heights area.
There were the ones that were most directly impacted by the fire were properties that we had worked with through our wildfire regulations. So they had pulled a building permit. Those were ones directly impacted, meaning there was fire on the property. Others were nearby and evacuated or within a mile of the fire perimeter.
Thanks, Eric. And so that leads us to come up with a summary of the impacts and the findings from the Lake Christine fire. First of all, we saw that we did end up there was some structure damage and loss. The fire resulted in evacuations, power failures. There was close to 13,000 acres burned. There's some post-fire soil stabilization negative outcomes, and the suppression costs were significant, and there was a significant requirement for infrastructure repairs. So as far as structure losses, most of the structure loss that we saw resulted from both radiant heat, and that was typically the structures that were adjacent to the slopes that didn't have initial setback from the slopes, and embers that carried beyond the actual fire front, igniting structures before the actual fire front ignited them, or even without the actual fire front reaching the structures. The home survival was significantly dependent on firefighter suppression. Initially, we found that, as Eric said, the mitigated homes did have an impact on the success of the firefighter suppression, but firefighter suppression was a necessary component of the survival of the homes. So yeah, definitely the mitigation actions on the properties, such as defensible space and the building constructions. From the interviews that we did with the firefighters, it did significantly support suppression activities, and in some cases, the mitigation actually resulted in independent home survival, meaning the homes did not receive any suppression actions, and the homes survived on their own.
Great. I wanted to see too, Eric, not to put you too much on the spot, but was there anything else you wanted to share from the findings, since we have the benefit of you being on the phone, before we move into our last couple of slides?
Yeah, just that, again, it was this combination of homeowners doing the work that made it possible for firefighters to safely be present that led to a great outcome. And in some cases, folks that had worked with us recently, in fact, we had one property that had met with me a matter of weeks before the fire, and were actively cutting trees right up until July 4th when they were evacuated. So for me, the take home was it's that shared responsibility, the role of the homeowner in supporting the role of firefighters.
Yeah, I would also say that what I found very valuable in the process of doing the post-fire assessment were the interviews with the fire chiefs that were on site, or the fire personnel that had responded. So, a special shout out to Vail Fire Department, for example, because they really took the time, both Paul Cada and Chief Novak, to share some very detailed information on their response in the Missouri Heights neighborhood. A number of others were very helpful in this process too, but there were a couple key things that stood out when we talked to them about that neighborhood, and especially as being a land use planner, although this wasn't necessarily the reason why we were doing the case study was to assess the development patterns, it was helpful for me to hear from the first person on what the challenges were at night in the dark with poorly signed areas, and some of these implications that decisions made at the planning stage of a subdivision. And there's a whole host of reasons why this occurs, but in terms of a first responder being put in a position where they weren't familiar with an area and they didn't necessarily know where they were, and so those firsthand accounts were very helpful for me to hear as someone who doesn't go out on fires and responds, but who looks more at the front end of the development process. So that again wasn't really the impetus for the assessment, but there were some, some learning that came out of that for me. So I'm actually going to do something a little bit different. I'm going to skip ahead. We have 2 more slides, and instead of our next slide, I'm going to skip ahead to one more slide, and then I'll go back to the examples. But just with tips and lessons learned, since I kind of started talking about this already, and we wanted to invite your lessons learned as well in the chat box. But, some of the things that came out of it for me were, when we started these success stories, I wanted to jump ahead to the conclusion already. And I had to remind myself that the scientific process really was, though, while we thought we had good mitigation stories, we really didn't know until we did all of the homework to know what conclusion we could tell. So I couldn't, as much as I wanted to, write the mitigation success first. I think we knew enough to think it was a mitigation success. But at the end of the day, we had to really be honest with the process and not get ahead of ourselves. So sticking to the science and sticking to the process was a helpful lesson for me. The other one was taking lots of photos and videos. It didn't seem like we could ever have enough of the photos, because as much as I thought I would remember things, having those detailed photos and notes with the photos was extremely helpful. In some cases, we also had to work with what we had, so it wasn't always ideal. There was some information missing on some of the other studies we've done, and there's only so much you can not have until you say, well, we don't have enough information to do the proper work. But in these cases, we had enough information. We just had to also be a little bit flexible with what we were trying to work with, and again, kind of the basics was sticking to the science. Is like, well, if we don't have the information, we can't make this conclusion if we really want these findings to be held up under scrutiny. The other piece too is just to keep, to the extent possible, especially sharing it, was to try and keep the story focused and relatable. And there was a temptation, for at least on my end, where when we talk about the story, to add in details that we hadn't studied but were interesting to me. I know that sounds kind of maybe funny, but I just wanting to share that I had to sometimes keep myself focused on what the story was really supposed to be about. So Kelly, I don't know if you have anything else you wanted to share just in terms of tips and lessons learned.
Well, I would agree with that. I mean, whoops, sorry, laptop fell over. I had the intensity to come to the propensity to come to my own conclusions. And it was really helpful to put it all together with the interviews of the folks that were actually on scene, because in some cases what they saw contradicted what I thought may have happened. And that was helpful. And in the end as well, not going too far astray and trying to keep this focused on what we were really focusing on was as Molly said, the fire is a larger thing. For me, it's easy to get wrapped up into, well, this is what happened with the fire over here and doing all of this. But really what we're focusing on is was the regulatory process that Eagle County has in place and the REALFire program, where the mitigation outcomes from those two processes, did they make a difference? And how much of a difference, and did they help fire suppression? Because that's really what we're looking for. So it was, good to really focus in. Those interviews were very helpful for me. I think they were extremely helpful, because you can come out to a totally different conclusion without them.
So we left some time intentionally for whether you had additional examples that you wanted to share from your own practice and work, or if there are other tips and lessons learned that you'd like to share. Of course, we're here to answer questions as well, but we really wanted to invite some learning exchange here. If there's anything else that you think is valuable to add to this conversation, I just put up a slide here of the lessons learned from Waldo Canyon, which was another example that I thought of that had a couple different, a video and a post-fire assessment report. So we'd welcome those that sharing, and we'd also welcome questions. And we'll put up our contact info here in just a minute as well.
Thank you, Molly. So we'll let you guys start putting your success stories of your own into the chat box, the discussion forum, and we've got a bunch of questions for you. I've been trying to answer some that I could. Daniel Beveridge wants to know which suppression resources were interviewed for the Cold Springs fire case study. Real quickly, maybe you could respond to that in the chat because I'm guessing you're going to list someone, but we've got a couple people. There's a good one from Kyle McCaddy that Emily is also wanting to know about. How do we balance being respectful for those that lost their homes while also taking advantage of the opportunity to share their success stories? In the case of the Lake Christine study, one of the homeowners who lost their home was also the deputy fire chief. So in that situation, we had great access, and I will let Kelly and Molly speak to how they handle that.
Sure, we could do the Cold Springs question first, as we did not directly interview, in person any first responders. It was a little bit different in that case because Kelly, and you can speak to this, you had access to a lot of the response data, but because this was one parcel, we looked at it a little bit differently. And in this case, we had talked to the homeowner, we talked to the county about what, if any, suppression resources had occurred on that one parcel. Kelly, I'd have to look back on my notes, but I believe that because of what you studied with the fire behavior and the work that the homeowner had done, the fire behavior actually changed on its own on that property. And that was one of the big findings.
Yeah, in Cold Springs, I mean, the homeowner had done, honestly, far beyond a significant more amount of work than what the Home Partners program was, had asked. He had been doing, pardon me?
Wildfire Partners program?
What? Sorry, Wildfire. What did I say? Home Partners?
Yeah, that's all right.
I'm sorry. That's a different program. Wildfire Partners. He had actually been undertaking a lot of his own mitigation. He'd been self-educating and taking on a lot of his own mitigation work, particularly to changing the fuel type. And so he had actually done a lot of species conversion. And when you look at the spread of the fire around his property, the head of the fire actually separated almost right where he had started doing the work and kind of gone around his property. So it was he had converted largely to aspen.
He was a very unique case too, in that he was kind of a self-trained wildfire mitigation. I don't know what else I'd call him, but he had taken it upon himself to learn a lot about landscape and fire behavior. I think he had even had some modeling done on his property. And then when he had this assessment, I have to say I was so impressed with the level of detail that he undertook for the assessment. And so it was, in some ways, it was a unique case, but I suppose it's those unique cases that allow us to tell those stories too. In terms of Emily's question, I think it was Emily or someone.
Kyle and Emily want to know how are we being respectful of home or those who lost home while taking advantage of this success story.
Yeah.
It didn't.
I think we had helped, or you had helped us with that, doing a little liaising, Eric, in terms of, not contacting that property owner who lost their home in the Lake Christine fire until, Eric, you had talked to them. And also, this wasn't necessarily intentional, but a little bit of time had passed. So he was already now in the kind of starting the rebuilding phase as opposed to the fresh loss phase. And so I think it was a little unique. He also had a lot of understanding about fire and, had served in that role of being, correct me if I'm wrong, he was on the fire department.
Yeah, the deputy chief. So pretty high level there, and was actively fighting the fire at his own home. Mm-hmm. And I believe there are several people, as I look through the names on this list, who were part of that suppression as well. So real quickly, we have 2 minutes. Jamie Gomez wants to know, this is obviously real heady, meaty stuff for fact practitioners like all of us, but how do we, what's our best way of communicating this stuff to homeowners? And since I use this study, Jamie, I'll answer it. You know, I know the names of the folks involved and tend to say, hey, you know, talk about it on a, this happened to your neighbor and here's what they did and here's how it went well. So you got to simplify it, take it up, make it personal would be my answer to that question. Molly and Kelly, would you add anything to that in our last minute and a half?
No, I think that's great. It reminds me actually of the 416 fire and the video that came out of that from the Firewise community. Just that personalized approach, I think, with the two homeowners was really great to hear them in their own words saying things too.
And then quickly to Caroline and Lucy, the structural loss during Lake Christine happened during the fire. I mean, it was a 28-day event and the structural loss was on the first few days. And then to Caroline, this was the Elgibel community of Eagle County and a neighborhood known as Missouri Heights.
And our website, it's a little light here, but the communitywildfire.org has the post-fire report on the Lake Christine fire. So you can download it there. You can also follow up with any questions. And, you know, I think thank you, Eric, and the rest of the hosts for putting this forum together, the virtual conference.
Yes, well, thank you all for presenting. We're going to bounce back over to some closing remarks from Becca and myself, and then we'll head to lunch. So we'll see you there.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys.